when that report first came out. And I wonder if you can sort of pick up this thread of all this exposure Trump has, the public statements that suggest he knew of that. The statements they put out today are just rehashes of here's actually, let me play this. This is Trump sort of moaning in December about the investigations into him. Let's listen.
If Mueller was looking at your finances or your family's finances unrelated to Russia, is that a red line?
Would that be a breach of what his actual
I would say
yes.
Yeah, I would say yes.
But if he was outside that lane, would that mean he'd have to go?
Would you?
No, I think that's a violation. Look, this is about Russia.
But what would you do?
I can't answer that question because I don't think it's going to happen.
So, Frank, that was the wrong sound, but let me ask you about this first. When we were young and innocent, we thought Robert Mueller might get Donald Trump for some ties to Russia if he looked at his businesses. It turns out we know now that, thanks largely to Andrew Weissman's book, he never looked at his businesses. But that was Trump's reaction on the front of all those assumptions made by everyone watching from the outside. Trump's saying to reporters from the New York Times, ostensibly so that Robert Mueller would hear them, that he would view it as a red line if anyone looked into his business conduct or his businesses, saying this is about Russia, my businesses are over here. It's along the same lines of what I'm going to show you next. His almost an ally of his calls it reptilian instincts for self-preservation. He himself knows that it's not pretty under the hood. Frank.
Yeah, Nicole, look, I think Trump has misjudged his exposure here. There's hubris here, and there's just bad gambling luck. So with regard to folks like Manafort, Stone, and others, he believed that he could control them, that they were loyal enough to him, or excuse me, disloyal enough that he didn't trust them, that he needed to dangle the pardons. He needed pardons and commutations. I think he's misjudged Weisselberg and others. I think he thought he was Teflon. This wouldn't happen. He was emboldened by Mueller not going after finances. And I think he's misplayed this. There's two takeaways I take from the very brief announcement from the New York State Attorney General yesterday. Number one, what does it mean when a civil case at the AG level in a state has turned criminal, now has a criminal component to it? When you're talking about the former president of the United States, it means something more than the bare minimum threshold of reasonable suspicion that a crime has occurred. I don't think she would make this announcement lightly or if she merely had reasonable suspicion. I think she's got strong evidence. I think she has specific and articulable facts that she's very confident in. Number two, the other part of that brief announcement was this coordination effort with the Manhattan District Attorney. What does that mean strategically? It means that when you're investigating some of the same people, and their same people are criminally exposed, and the same other people might be your informants, your cooperating witnesses, you've got to come together as two prosecutive entities and not speak at opposite ends, right? You've got to offer people the same deal. You really need to coordinate your intelligence. And if the same people are exposed, you've got to figure out the division of labor. Who's going after Trump personally? That appears to be the DA in Manhattan with tax issues. Who's going after the organization? That appears to be the AG. But make no mistake for your viewers, just because it's an organizational prosecution does not mean human beings in that organization can't go to prison as part of that case. In fact, as part of most white-collar crime cases against corporation, there is heated discussion, often between agents and prosecutors, about whether or not someone deserves to go to prison. And what do they look at for those criteria? Are there things in place to have prevented this? Was this a one-off, an anomaly, or is there more systemic fraud? Is there evidence of intent? My message to the Trump family who are officers in the organization today is, if you don't all have separate lawyers representing you on the organization case, do not trust that one organization attorney who represents the organization's interests to represent your interests. It's time to separately lawyer up and realize that you may have different interests than your brother, sister, or father.
There's so much to unpack there. Let me follow up with you, Frank. I mean, is the Enron prosecution an example of a business that was prosecuted but individuals went to jail? Is that the kind of prosecution that they could be imagining?
Yeah, absolutely. In the majority of big corporate white-collar cases, there's a fine levied. The corporation's trying to get it right. They slipped up. There were some low-level people that screwed up, even intentionally, and you don't see CEOs and officers go to prison. But in a case like this, if they can show systemic fraud, knowledge, intent, no fiduciary responsibility mechanisms in place, just no one really caring about things getting done right, and if the intent goes to the top, you're going to see people go to prison.
Well, Frank, wasn't that part of Donald Trump's campaign message? I mean, he kind of ran as a guy who figured out how to cheat on his taxes. He ran as a guy who was proud of all of the ways that he found to screw the government. And that was his reason for wanting to be president. Does an investigation, can they sort of re-examine that in light of evidence they gather? I mean, I also want to play for you the sound that I talked about before, Frank. This is him talking in December, and it seems to be weighing very heavily on him, what he knows to be criminal exposure. Let me play the right tape this time.
Now I hear that these same people that failed to get me in Washington have sent every piece of information to New York so that they can try to get me there. They want to take not me, but us down. And we can never let them do that.
I mean, there's not, his own allies will tell us that there are not a lot of people at the Trump organization. Let me bring you in on this, Tim O'Brien. I mean, isn't that the case? It's not about getting others. I mean, this was a very small office, mostly run by Trumps, right?
Right. You know, when we're comparing this to, say, Enron or Arthur Andersen or WorldCom, some of these major white-collar fraud investigations, those are big corporations. They aren't the mom and pop shop sitting above a grocery store that is essentially what the Trump organization is. And loyalty in that organization goes one way. Donald Trump is notoriously disloyal to anyone who presents a threat to him or complicates his life, and he throws them under the bus at the drop of a hat. Allen Weisselberg has been loyal to him for decades because they are bound by money. They're not bound by emotion. And now that Tish James has extended her investigation into a criminal probe, it changes the outcome here. A civil case has a financial penalty. A criminal case can land you in prison. And everyone inside that organization now is weighing how much it is in their own self-interest to protect Trump when the paycheck or the money at the end of the day doesn't actually equate with your own personal freedom. And I think that's why it's so significant that Weisselberg is getting squeezed by these investigators. Because if they turn Weisselberg, it opens the door to decades of financial chicanery and possibly criminal behavior that Trump has been proximate to. And then they'll have to show that he had knowledge of it. That's going to be a hurdle. But as I think Frank and Neil both said, I don't think Tish James would have gone down this road if she didn't believe she had strong evidence in hand that showed someone within the Trump organization had knowledge of a crime, and they're going to leverage that to move up the food chain.
Neil, it just opens a million questions about what happens next. I mean, would you predict that behind the scenes there's a lawyer for Donald Trump trying to work out what would happen if he's indicted and charged? I mean, what do you think is happening that we can't see?
Hard to imagine Donald Trump has a lawyer because every lawyer he has quits on him or something because Trump stiffs him and doesn't pay the bills. But maybe he found someone. And anyone worth their salt absolutely would be asking exactly that question. And yeah, I suppose Donald Trump is sitting there taking comfort in the fact that most corporate cases don't result in jail time. But I think Tim's point here is a really important one. And the DNA of publicly traded big institutional companies is compliance with the law. And the Trump organization, I think their compliance department was basically a giant Sharpie pen of the presidential seal or something like that. You know, they don't have the kind of checks in there. And so you can't rely on that past track record for publicly traded corporations when it gets to something like the Trump organization. So absolutely, I suspect that Donald Trump Jr., Eric, Ivanka, Weisselbergs, they all are lawyering up. I mean, as I said, Trump is the greatest jobs program for lawyers imaginable. They'll probably all have separate counsel, and they're all sitting there asking those questions. And perhaps some of them are sitting there saying, should I make a deal? Should I take a flip? Obviously, incredibly difficult.